Good morning and afternoon. This is Session A of the ArchivesSpace Virtual Member Forum 2025. Welcome to our presentation, A Rainbow of Flavors, Managing an Array of Digital Content in ASpace from Accessioning through Access. Our presenting group includes Elizabeth Karen, Senior Accessioning Archivist, and Elizabeth Peters, Lynn Moulton, and myself, Molly L. Shire, who are all Senior Processing Archivists. We are from the Burns Library at Boston College, and today we will be discussing 3 practical approaches we take in ArchivesSpace to manage born digital and digitized content across its life cycle. From acquisitions to access, these methods help us manage and safeguard backlog, streamline description, and make this content accessible. Also, perhaps most importantly for today's talk, our workflows are designed to fit seamlessly into archival collection management. For accession materials, digital objects represent complex, minimally described content in preservation storage. Digital objects provide an organized, structured way to track materials without delving into deep description. Our accessioning archivist utilizes standardized naming conventions, pre-populated templates, and clear preservation workflows. For processed born digital and migrated audiovisual materials accessible only in our reading room, reinterpreted top container instances allow digital content to be requested and paged parallel to analog material requesting and retrieving. And finally, for digitized materials accessible online, digital objects connect researchers from the file description to the viewer. These are generally materials for which the digitized version provides enhanced or expanded access, but the digital is not intended to replace access to the original item. By utilizing out-of-the-box solutions with minimal customization, these workflows stay scalable and adaptable. We will outline our strategies, their exciting benefits and occasional shortcomings, and how other repositories can integrate them to enhance digital material management for staff and for researchers. The following presentation shows the slice of work done by the accessioning and processing archivists, but our team relies on many Boston College colleagues who support our infrastructure, image our content, migrate off media, fund our work, and provide access. We also rely on larger communities such as ArchivesSpace, of course, and AP Trust. During our discussion, we will show you demonstrations with examples from our repository. After the recording, please join us for a live Q&A session. Now here is Elizabeth Karen, our accessioning archivist, to tell you about accessioning born digital content.
Good morning and good afternoon for those of you who have already had your morning. My name is Elizabeth Karen, and I am the accessioning archivist for Burns Library. I'm going to run you through basically how we create and manage digital objects for accession records. This might be a bit of a different workflow or consideration for many of you who perhaps are only using digital objects to describe and manage digital objects for process collections via resource records. So my number 1 rule that I always want to focus on is that for accession records here at Burns Library, when we are talking about digital objects, we are referring to complex, minimally described content and preservation storage. Now, unlike described collections, accessions can describe content in aggregate, in bulk. We don't get down into the nitty-gritty when it comes to accessioning. Now, this means that each accession almost always has only one DO associated with it. Here at Burns, while there are exceptions to multiple DOs for single accessions, these cases are rare. They're usually tied to legacy practices and acquisitions or access needs. And if you're interested in exploring those exceptions, I'm happy to discuss them in more detail after the presentation. I just want to emphasize they are exceptions, not the rule. This page, we have a list of digital objects, and this page reflects all the digital objects in our repository. We can tell from the fact that these are published that these digital objects are associated with described process collections. However, we're not talking about them. We're talking about accession materials. Here at Burns Library, our accession records are actually, they're closed, they're restricted. We're a private institution. We have a lot of good reasons why we don't make accession records available. Again, I'm happy to talk about those exceptions after the presentation. But just to set the scene, A good way for us to be able to tell whether or not something is related to an accession or something is related to a process collection is by looking at this field over here with published true and false. Anyway, an even more simple way to do this is to take a peek at how we name our digital objects when they're related to accessions. Now, to ensure consistency and reproducibility, we use human readable naming conventions. This really helps them, again, to distinguish them from DOs related to process collections, but honestly, what this does is it makes it so much easier for us to conduct periodic backlog audits. We want to be able to identify how much content we have that is currently in backlog, just as anyone would want to do while managing backlog for physical collections. So before I leave you with the processing team, I'm going to briefly run you through an example of what accessions and digital objects look like when they work together. So this is the an accession that records a donation of Haley House records. The Haley House is actually a collection that's processed and now described. I'm working in the test instance, so information's a little slow. You're welcome to look at the Haley House records on our public user interface. It's called findingaids.bc.edu. At least that's what I call it. That's also the URL. I would encourage you to see how we end up processing this collection and how the DO formation was actually implemented in that case. However, let's get back to this accession. You'll see here that I have a content description. I think it's a pretty detailed abstract of what is in the accession. So when we talk about how I'm only describing a single, a bulk amount of material and I'm managing it by a single DO, that can be a bit off-putting for people. People want to have a bit more granular control and they want to be able to understand what exactly is in the backlog. It's not enough to have extents and file counts. We need to know what the content is. So I do provide content descriptions. We also create inventories on a case-by-case basis. I did in this particular case because I deemed the accession worth it. However, if I'm operating and there's like maybe assumption there's 2 PDFs, the content description field here should be enough for you to adequately describe the 2 PDFs. Here's where you are really interested, though, the digital object. You'll see here, here's that naming convention again, and here's how the digital object is represented as a linked record. And we click on it, and you can see here what it looks like. So we have the title, and that's the naming convention. This is the identifier, and the identifier is actually supplied to me by our digital archives specialist. He and I work together in tandem to make sure the materials are acquired and ingested at the point of accessioning. They don't just sit in someone's inbox or on a Google Drive somewhere. What's probably a little alarming to you all is that we have 2 different file versions of the SIP. So a SIP is the submission information package. We call it a submission master. It's basically the box we got when a donor drops something off and we haven't done any weeding. That is what a submission information package is. In this particular case, we keep a preservation light copy on our local server, and this is what we're probably going to be working with the most when we get to the processing projects. We also keep a dark archive copy in AP Trust, Academic Preservation Trust. It's a tremendously cool service, and if you have any questions, I strongly recommend you reach out to Amy Brach, who is my boss, but she's also she is also our liaison for the AP Trust partnership. Basically what happens though is that once we finally finished processing the collections, we are able to go back and say we don't need the SIPs anymore. We have an APE, an archival information package. The APE is what is important to preserve, not the SIPs. So just like any sort of weeding that needs to be done or decisions as to not to retain extra copies, so on and so forth, we get rid of these. We delete these in Persian for our systems, and so we're not managing materials in duplicate.
Hello, I'm Elizabeth Peters, one of the processing archivists at Burns. For process-born digital and migrated audiovisual content accessible only in our reading room, we use top container instances to allow digital content to be requested and paged in a similar way to analog material. This is different from what you might expect. There's an obvious connection from digital and digitized content to digital object instances. In our case, however, there are 2 problems with this approach. Firstly, Digital objects are primarily useful for providing links to content. Since we don't currently have a DAMS or a system like Preservica or Archivematica, our digital content doesn't have any sort of URL that we could add to a digital object. Instead, we create a preservation bag that we store via AP Trust and access copies that we store on local servers. Secondly, digital objects don't allow for researcher requesting in the same way that container instances do. We could use digital objects to store the pathways to each file on our local servers. However, if we did that, the access pathway would be kind of burdensome for our public services staff and leave significant room for human error. So instead, our team decided to treat digital and digitized content that is accessible only in the reading room exactly how we would treat analog materials accessible in the same way, by creating a container instance for the digital folder on our Access server. We got this idea originally from the team at Duke and adapted it slightly just to fit our particular situation. To do this, we had to answer 3 questions. Number 1, what is the container profile of a digital folder? Number 2, what is the container type and number? And number 3, how do we record the location of a digital container? So for the first question, we created a container profile in ArchivesSpace called a virtual box. It has dimensions of 0. This signals to the researcher that something digital is happening, something virtual, but it also doesn't affect our use of the extent calculator at the collection level because it has a size of 0. Here's an example with digital content in a instance. For the identifier, we use the same information across platforms, repeating it for the ArchivesSpace instance, the preservation copy file name, and the access copy file name. Conveniently, the ArchivesSpace primary key is easily findable, unique, and stable. So for each instance, we name the container by the primary key of the associated archival object. The container type we call digital content number and include a conditions governing access note on the AO informing researchers about what they're requesting. Both the preservation and access copies are also identified using this same number, so we can look up the actual content very easily. For the location of the object, we created a separate quote-unquote building called Access server. This signals to our public services staff that they need to go to that particular server and look for the folder with the matching primary key, which they then transfer to the Access computer in the reading room. That Access folder also contains photographs of any physical original media, also identified with the corresponding primary key. This enables researchers to virtually access the item, such as an audio cassette, without accessing the physical item itself, and it gives them a more complete facsimile. To tie up this whole process, we create an event with the type preservation, where we record the path to our 2 preservation locations, the resource the preserved content belongs to, the staff members who carried out the work, and when the work was completed. For a researcher, this approach doesn't appear much different from requesting a physical box. They see the same request button that takes them to our Aeon implementation, where they then place their request. In general, we have found that making our workflows for analog and digital and digitized content as similar as possible prevents mishaps and allows us to pivot more smoothly when we need to, since we only need to learn and adjust one workflow rather than multiple. This approach still requires staff to work across systems that don't link together, but the use of unique identifiers allows us to do this with minimal room for error.
Hi, I'm Lynn Moulton, a processing archivist at Burns, and I'm going to tell you about our use of digital objects to provide access to digitized content that is available online. For nearly 3 decades, Boston College libraries have been digitally imaging archival material and putting the images online. During that time, the systems and access approaches have changed, but the constant has been an ever-growing body of facsimiles of archival materials completely accessible online. We are now at the point that the description and primary discovery point for these materials is within the context of the archival collection, which for us is the ArchivesSpace public user interface. Hooray! For these digital archival materials, we use ArchivesSpace digital objects to connect researchers from the file description to our viewer, which is a Mirador IIIF viewer. These are generally materials for which the digitized version provides enhanced or expanded access, but the digital is not intended to fully replace access to the original item, unlike our migrated audiovisual archival materials mentioned previously. Because of the value of described archival context, and because we want to support researchers being able to toggle between the online item to requesting further materials to access in person, we appreciate ArchivesSpace growing capacity to represent digital objects within collections. Here is our fairly vanilla use of digital objects for digitized materials. My example digital item is a letter taken from the collection of an early Boston College president, John Bapst. The title for the digital object is taken from the title for the archival object. The digital object identifier is the collection number plus the primary key of the archival object. Publish is true once the images and manifest are in our viewer. At present, we currently build and publish simultaneously via the DO importer. Our representative file version is the thumbnail, so the file URI points to a thumbnail in our viewer. This URL would have to be replaced if we change systems, but we've been consistent with our metadata so that this could be done in bulk. Publish and representative are both true. The xlink actuate attribute is on load, and the xlink show attribute is embed. All of this together yields a visible thumbnail on the AO and DO in the PUI. For the non-representative file version, the URI is a handle that is pointed at the first image of the digitized complex object in the viewer. Publish is true, but representative is false. The image pointed to by the URL is a compound IIIF object that wouldn't play nice as a thumbnail in ASpace. The xlink actuate attribute is on request, and the xlink show attribute is new. These together make a clickable link from the DO to the viewer. If we go back to the original archival object and view this in the public user interface, the resulting digital object has a clickable link and a clickable thumbnail that leads directly to the viewer and any number of images in the viewer that make up the compound object. This classic digital object use to represent digitized collections online has lots of advantages for us. While we don't currently have a DAMS, we built our usage flexibly and consistently to support connection to additional systems in the future. Our use of permanent URLs or handles simplifies future redirects to other viewers. For now, this approach reduces the steps for a user to get from discovery in ASpace to our viewer. It is worth mentioning that our systems staff have customized our use of the PUI just a little to reduce the click-through from the JPEG thumbnail to the image in the resulting viewer. This approach is also technically pretty simple and now uses mostly out-of-the-box functionality, which lets us ask a bit less of our partners in library systems and digital production. We get our descriptive data for this process out of ArchivesSpace through the bulk edit download, and the data back in to build digital objects using the DO bulk import spreadsheet. We are currently especially grateful for the newest 4.0 release and the added fields for DOs in the spreadsheet import. Alongside our amazing Special Collections Public Services colleagues, we are really leaning into the ArchivesSpace public user interface for discovery. This allows us to take advantage of the inheritance of information from parent entries and therefore spend less time re-articulating description on each AO and resulting DO. Given the ever-growing scale of archival collections and their digital components, this currently feels like the right approach. Both of our aforementioned approaches for digital described content lean heavily into this philosophy. Thank you for watching today, and we look forward to your questions.